Right now, there's a number floating around every AI forum and comment section.
Gemini 4 supposedly has 2 trillion parameters. If that's real, it wouldn't just be big, it would be roughly double the size people are pointing to for the latest ChatGPT, and it would dwarf anything Anthropic has shipped with Claude or XAI has shipped with Grok this year. We're talking about a model bigger than anything the industry has ever publicly put a number on. I spent hours going through Google's own statements, its earnings calls, and investigative reporting from Bloomberg and Reuters to figure out what's actually behind that number, because a figure that size doesn't happen by accident. And what I found wasn't just a bigger model. It was a story about why Google might have needed one this big in the first place, one that starts with a broken promise back in May and gets a lot messier from there.
Look at this data from the Census Bureau. Only about 1 in 5 US businesses actually use AI in their operations. So if you run a business, and you're even thinking about this, you're ahead of most of your competition. What you might not know is that alongside covering AI news, we work with business owners to help them implement AI in their business. Our engineering team gets to know how your business runs, then builds the automation with you. You'll find the link in the description below. Click it, fill out a short form about your business, and we'll get in touch to set up a call.
So in this video, I'm walking you through exactly what happened to Gemini 3.5 Pro, why Google's own reporting and its own executives point to coding as a real part of the problem, and what's actually behind Gemini 4, including where that 2 trillion number really comes from. By the end, you'll know exactly what's confirmed about this model, what's still guesswork, and what that headline figure actually tells you. Let's start with the promise Google made in May and broke. The promise Google broke. At Google I/O on May 19th, Sundar Pichai stood on stage and made a specific dated commitment. He said Google was already using Gemini 3.5 Pro internally, that it was showing great improvements, and that it would be coming next month. That's not a leak. That's not an analyst's guess. That's Google's own CEO, at Google's own flagship event, putting a month on the calendar in front of everyone. And it wasn't just a name drop. Pichai framed 3.5 Pro around agentic coding, long horizon tasks, and real-world workflows, exactly the areas where the rest of the industry was about to get aggressive. This was supposed to be Google's answer to that pressure. June came. June went. No Gemini 3.5 Pro. And Google didn't say anything about it publicly for another 6 weeks. The language that gave it away. On July 21st, Google finally addressed it, sort of. In a blog post announcing other Gemini updates, the company said 3.5 Pro was currently testing with partners and would become broadly available as soon as it's ready. Notice what happened to the language. In May, it was a month. In July, it's a condition. Next month became when it's ready, and no replacement date was ever given. If you've worked around any product team, you know exactly what that phrasing means. It means the internal deadline moved, and nobody wants to commit to the next one out loud. And here's the part that actually matters most for this video. In that same paragraph, Google revealed it had started what it called its most ambitious pre-training run yet, for Gemini 4. A brand new flagship, named for the very first time, appearing in the exact breath where the old flagship's launch date quietly disappeared. That timing alone doesn't prove anything on its own. Companies run multiple model generations in parallel all the time. But it's the first thread in a pattern that gets a lot stronger once you bring in what reporters were hearing from inside the building. What the insiders told reporters. On July 16th, Bloomberg published an investigation reporting that Google was months behind schedule specifically because it was trying to improve 3.5 Pro's capabilities, and it named coding directly. The report cited 10 current and former employees describing broader concern inside the company about losing ground to Anthropic and OpenAI. That's not one disgruntled employee venting anonymously. That's 10 separate people, some of them still at the company, painting a consistent picture to a major outlet. Then, on August 12th, almost a month later, Reuters ran its own independent investigation and landed on something strikingly similar. Internal testing showed the delayed flagship continuing to lag rivals in areas such as coding. Reuters went further too. It reported that Sergey Brin, one of Google's actual co-founders, had personally pushed AI staff to move faster, telling a company town hall back in April to go all in on Gemini. Sit with that timing for a second. Brin was reportedly pushing for urgency in April, a full month before Pichai stood on stage and promised the world a June release, which raises an uncomfortable question. 2 separate outlets, citing separate sources, months apart, landed on the exact same word, coding. That's not one anonymous tip. That's a pattern, and it's the strongest circumstantial evidence in this entire story. Pichai finally says it himself. A day after that July 21st blog post, Pichai got asked about it directly on Alphabet's earnings call. Investors wanted to know about the coding gap everyone had started talking about, and he didn't dodge it. He said there were areas where Gemini needed to improve, and he named them specifically: coding and agentic coding. That's a CEO, live on an earnings call, in front of investors and analysts, confirming the exact weakness Bloomberg had reported 5 days earlier. Companies don't casually admit that kind of thing unless they have to. Then, seconds later in the same answer, he pivoted to the fix. He said the next frontier of competition would require much larger base models, that Gemini 4 was being trained ambitiously, and that Google would need Gemini 4 as a larger base model to compete at that frontier. He added one more detail that's easy to miss, but tells you a lot about the mindset here. Google isn't trying to beat where its rivals are today. Pichai said the goal is to compete at the frontier where it will be when Gemini 4 comes out, meaning they're trying to build for a moving target months in the future, not the leaderboard as it looks right now. That's the strongest piece of evidence in this entire story. Not a leak, not a rumor, Google's own CEO, on the record, on an earnings call, connecting an admitted weakness directly to the reason Gemini 4 exists in its current, unusually large form. 6 weeks, 6 rivals. Here's what makes that delay so costly. While Gemini 3.5 Pro sat in partner testing, the rest of the industry didn't wait around, because the comparison people keep reaching for isn't Google versus one rival. It's Google versus everyone, all at once. Anthropic shipped Claude Sonnet 5 on June 30th, positioned explicitly around coding, tool use, and agents, landing the same week Google's original June window closed. OpenAI followed with the GPT 5.6 family on July 9th, after already previewing a stronger agentic coding model. xAI launched Grok 4.5 on July 16th, the very same day Bloomberg's report about Google's delay dropped. Anthropic came back again with Claude Opus 5 on July 24th, claiming a major step forward in long-horizon software engineering. xAI shipped Grok 4.6 on August 12th, the same day as Reuters' investigation. And DeepSeek's V4 Pro went fully generally available on August 13th, built from the ground up for agentic work. 6 major flagship releases, from 4 different companies, in roughly 6 weeks, while Google's flagship stayed behind closed doors the entire time. Even if 3.5 Pro had been genuinely competitive back in June, the bar it needed to clear kept moving. Every few days it stayed unreleased. That's the moving target problem in a nutshell. You can't just build a model that beats today's competition. By the time you ship, today's competition has already shipped something new. Quick question for the comments while we're here. Out of those 6 releases, which one do you think actually raised the bar the most? I'll read through and reply to a few once this goes up. Is Gemini can't code actually fair? Before we go further, it's worth pushing back on the simplest version of this story, because Google can't code isn't really true, and getting this wrong would undersell what's actually going on. Back in February, Gemini 3.1 Pro Preview was independently ranked first on Artificial Analysis's coding index, scoring 54% on Terminal Bench Hard and around 59% on SciCode. It also topped their overall intelligence index. That's not a company's own marketing, that's an independent third party. And that model hasn't suddenly gotten worse either. On Artificial Analysis's current SciCode leaderboard, Gemini 3.1 Pro still sits at 58.9%, just behind Claude Fable 5 at 60.2%, and ahead of most of the field. So where's the actual gap? It shows up specifically on agentic software engineering, tasks where a model has to work a terminal, navigate a real repository, recover from its own mistakes, and do it over dozens of steps instead of answering one clean prompt. On the current Terminal Bench 2.1 leaderboard, GPT 5.6 sole leads at 89.5%, with Claude Opus 5 at 89.1%, and Grok 4.6 at 88.4%. Google's own numbers show 3.7 Flash making real progress here too, roughly an 8-point jump on that same benchmark compared to its predecessor, but it's still chasing, not leading. That's the real, more precise story. Gemini isn't bad at writing code. It's behind on the harder, messier skill the whole industry is racing toward right now, acting like an autonomous engineer that can operate independently for long stretches, instead of a very good autocomplete. So where does 2 trillion actually come from? Let's close the loop from the top of this video. I went looking for the source of that 2 trillion parameter figure for Gemini 4, and the honest answer is, there isn't one. No Google blog post, no earnings call, no research paper. It's the kind of number that starts as somebody's guess, gets repeated in a comment section, then shows up in a video title, and by the third or fourth repost, it just reads as fact. That's not a knock on anyone. It's just how numbers like this spread when a company stays quiet. And even if a number like that does eventually leak, it's worth understanding why it wouldn't tell you as much as it sounds like it would. Modern frontier models mostly aren't one giant block of parameters doing all the work on every single request. Most of today's leading systems use a mixture of experts design, where a model might have an enormous total parameter count on paper, but only a fraction of it, the active parameters, actually fires for any given answer. That's exactly why a model with a smaller total size can still outperform a much larger one on real tasks. Total parameter count, by itself, has stopped being a reliable proxy for how capable a model actually is. That's also why companies have mostly stopped leading with that number in official announcements. It's a headline-friendly stat, not a meaningful benchmark. What actually separates these models in 2026 is architecture, training data quality, and post-training. The reinforcement learning and fine-tuning that shapes how a model behaves after the base training is done. So even in a world where a Gemini 4 parameter count eventually leaks, the number that matters more is how it performs on exactly the benchmarks we just walked through: agentic coding, long horizon tasks, tool use. That's the comparison actually worth waiting for. What we actually know about Gemini 4. This is the part where I have to be honest with you, because it's also where most other videos on this topic are going to mislead you. What's actually confirmed, straight from Google, the name Gemini 4, the fact that pre-training has started. Google's own most ambitious pre-training run yet description. Pichai calling it a larger base model needed to compete at the next frontier. And Pichai saying Google is putting significant compute and effort behind it. What's not confirmed by anyone with a verifiable source: the parameter count. The architecture, whether it's dense or mixture of experts. The training token count, the context window, the exact training hardware, and critically, the release date. None of that has come from Google. Not one official number. So if you've seen a headline throwing around a specific parameter count for Gemini 4, something like a clean 2 trillion figure, or a matching number for a rival model, treat it with real skepticism. As of the making of this video, Google has not disclosed that number, and neither has anyone else with a track record worth trusting. Anyone stating it as settled fact is guessing, or repeating someone else's guess. The reorg behind the curtain. There's one more piece that shows how seriously Google is treating this. On August 5th, Google restructured DeepMind's leadership. Demis Hassabis moved from day-to-day management into the role of chair of Google DeepMind and chief scientist of Alphabet. Kore Kavukoglu took over as SVP, reporting directly to Pichai, now with direct responsibility over Gemini model development, frontier research, and the product teams around it. Pichai's own message to the company said Google needed to accelerate and was super focused on the exact areas it had just admitted needed improvement. Hassabis, in the same announcement, said Gemini development was already effectively in Kavukoglu's hands, and specifically cited great progress on Gemini 4.
Reuters also reported that several senior AI leaders, including Jeff Dean, Sanjay Gamawat, Oriol Vinyals, and Kwok Lee, were leaving around the same time to start a separate venture called Discovery Loop. That's not a junior team shuffle. Those are some of the most recognizable names in Google's AI history, exiting in the same window as this leadership shakeup. None of that proves Gemini 4 was built purely to rescue a failed 3.5 Pro, but it does show a company reorganizing its entire AI leadership structure in the middle of its most ambitious training run, right after publicly admitting a competitiveness gap on an earnings call. That's not a coincidence of timing. That reads a lot more like pressure. The verdict. So here's what we know. Google promised Gemini 3.5 Pro for June and missed it. Bloomberg and Reuters both tied the delay to coding weaknesses, and Pichai later acknowledged that gap himself, while pointing to Gemini 4 as the larger model Google needs to compete at the frontier. What we can't prove is that Gemini 4 exists purely because 3.5 Pro struggled. Google still calls it the next generation, not a rescue mission. The evidence suggests Gemini 4 is being shaped by the problems Google encountered with 3.5 Pro, especially agentic coding. But the exact parameter count, release date, and much of the architecture remain unknown. So for now, 3.5 Pro is still unreleased, Gemini 4 is still training, and the biggest claims around it remain speculation. What do you think? Normal next-generation model, or a quiet rescue mission? Let me know below, and if you want more grounded AI breakdowns like this, stick around. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.